starting in the 1980s, Latin America began to liberalize their economies, reducing international trade barriers. Today, the region faces regular economic shocks, is consistently undercut by other countries, and faces some of the highest poverty rates in the world. For a country to benefit from international trade, it needs to be in a competitive position with a strong economy by itself. O'Neill on the Council of Foreign Relations in 2022 explains that Latin America has not benefited from globalization because of lack of regionalization, which has hindered its economic growth. Compare that to East Asia, which in the 1990s began to build regional economic ties through organizations like ASEAN before participating in globalization. Today, South Korea and Japan are some of the most developed economies in the world. The fact remains that if Latin America wants to benefit from global trade, it must first prioritize intra-regional trade and become more self-sufficient, which is why BASIS affirms. Our sole contention is protecting Latin America. Greater regional ties will benefit Latin America in two key ways. The first is by expanding infrastructure. Right now, Har of the Wilson Center last year explains that Latin American countries don't have enough investment into crucial facilities, with an infrastructure gap of $150 billion per year. The Economist in 2018 confirms that 60% of roads are unpaved, 2/3 of sewage is not treated, and electricity issues in the region are among the most prevalent in the world. Investors in faraway markets are not reliable. The UN this year quantifies that there is a 22% decrease of foreign investment in the region and a 40% drop in deals. Thankfully, prioritizing intra-regional trade can help. The World Economic Forum in 2016 explains that because a lack of infrastructure hinders trade and increases costs, building regional supply chains demands investment. Overall, that saves lives, as the UN in 2024 quantifies that the lack of infrastructure in the region has made it so that 17 million lack access to electricity, 161 million lack access to clean drinking water, and 431 people lack proper sanitation. Beyond saving lives, infrastructure is necessary for the region's economic potential. The Economist in 2024 explains that without adequate energy, port, and road communication, Latin America will not be an attractive location for long-term investments. The World Bank continues that by simplifying border procedures and regulations, initiatives for intra-regional trade have driven down the cost of trade by 67%. Overall, Moreau in 2023 finalized that closing the infrastructure gap would boost GDP by 7% by spurring greater economic trade and growth. The second way is by protecting it from economic shocks. Right now, the IMF in 2017 finds that Latin American countries continue to be dependent on exporting raw commodities to developed countries for their economic prospects. The Economist in 2023 quantifies that 21 countries get more than half of their export revenue from the sale of these raw commodities, which can be dangerous when global supply shocks occur. Unfortunately, the Council on Foreign Relations in 2022 finds that without strong commercial ties to nearby nations, workers and consumers tend to be limited to sending out raw materials and bringing in finished products as they're forced to specialize for international demands. Thankfully, they continue that by buying and selling more to and from each other, Latin American companies would ensure jobs are created within the region rather than outside it. Because countries would have to be more self and regionally sufficient rather than specializing in global supply chains, it would increase the chances of economic diversification and development. Diversification is key. The World Bank Group in 2019 explains that it helps to manage volatility. When a country's economy is more well-rounded, an economic shock won't cause as much overall harm, and the country can quickly recover, like many developed economies do. For example, East Asia made such a growth transition in the 90s, and today these countries are some of the most developed and economically resilient countries in the world. Indeed, Georgina 22 of the IMF furthers that diversification can cut the economic effect of shocks by 50%. Prioritizing recovering from future shocks is critical, as Borelli of the BBVA in 2022 quantifies that shocks in 2020 caused 20 million Latin Americans to fall into poverty. Thus, BASIS is proud to affirm.
Just before I start, hi, my name is Vishwa, speaking first for Langley on the conference. Is everyone good to go? Let's start our time now. For decades, Latin America has lagged behind more developed countries for a litany of reasons. Specifically, economics professor Philippe Lorraine finds Latin American countries have been geographically disadvantaged, being far away from key markets, and have been culturally fragmented, inhibiting their ability to trade with one another. From the historical failure of agreements such as the Pacific Alliance and the Central American Common Market to the recent breakdown of Mercosur over political disagreements, it's clear that regional agreements have failed in Latin America. Thankfully, Lorraine continues that international trade has the potential to reverse this trend by creating markets attractive to investors. In fact, after opening up to international trade since the 1980s, investment in Chile increased, and the country now has the highest per capita income and lowest poverty rate in the region. which is why Langley is proud to negate, and our sole contention is promoting Latin America's future. Neglecting international trade will harm Latin America in two key ways. Our first argument concerns investment. While local actors have dropped the ball, international trade pushes global superpowers to channel investment into Latin America. The Council on Foreign Relations in 2023 finds China's close economic ties to the region have made it a major source of investment in infrastructure. This has motivated the U.S. to step up its efforts. Hussein last November finds Biden is trying to increase trade with Latin America as an effort to disrupt China. As a result, the U.S. Department of State last November quantifies that in the past 2 years, the U.S. has provided more than $2.1 billion to the region. Accordingly, Day 22 furthers that construction has made steady progress in Latin America, increasing efficiency by 75% and traffic by 100% in areas. And Arbachi 24 continues, the region is going to grow in 2024 at a higher rate compared to most advanced countries. In addition, Tao of the Brussels School of Governance concludes that the loans provided are structured in a way to make repayment easy for low-income nations. However, stepping away from international trade destroys these incentives. Koch of the University of Hamburg finds sufficient levels of trade are considered preconditions for aid. When countries suspend economic relationships, the cost for non-compliance is often negative measures taken in development policy like aid benefits. A loss of infrastructure investment would be deadly, as the UN in 2022 quantifies that in the region, a lack of infrastructure has caused 161 million to lack access to safe drinking water and 431 million to lack access to sanitation. The World Economic Forum in 2016 explains a lack of infrastructure hinders trade and increases costs, while Moreau in 2023 finalizes closing the infrastructure gap in the region would boost its GDP by 7%. Our second argument concerns modernization. Latin America is quickly becoming a hotbed of development, as reporter Jerry McGovern this year finds that today, high-tech American companies are searching for data centers, particularly in Latin America, where the volume of data processed has doubled in 4 years. Latin American AI innovation is also heating up. DDO this year finds the region is a promising landscape which needs investment to close the gap between it and global leaders like the US and China. US-based company Globant last year announced a $1 billion investment into the region's AI and is in the process of hiring 20,000 professionals across Latin America. Unfortunately, turning away from our international partners jeopardizes this steady progress. Trent Schweitzer of Whiteface this year confirms that trade restrictions prevent AI development by restricting training data and commercial services. Ference in 2022 confirms that tariffs reduce exports of computing equipment and data centers. That's terrible for the Latin American economy. The DCC explains that data centers create long-term jobs in a multitude of sectors, and for every one data center job, there are 6.4 other jobs created in the economy. In addition, Latin America must continue its AI development with international investment, as Hermasia 23 concludes that AI development will help multiple sectors, boosting the region's GDP by 5% by the year 2030. Otherwise, Bahoria of the Council on Foreign Relations concludes every 1% decline in developing country growth drops another 20 million people into poverty. For these reasons, we are so proud to negate. And Sean, I'm good with this.
We can take first question.
Did you say you wanted it? Or?
No, we can take it.
Oh, good. I guess we'll start on infrastructure. If Latin American countries have the capability to build infrastructure in the region that would help 500 million people by themselves, why haven't they done it already?
So the problem is that currently they do not have the political will to develop infrastructure in the moment, and we're going to read further evidence that says that when they did do intra-regional trade, there were more inflows of investment to the region.
Why don't they have the political will to help the 500 million people that are struggling right now?
Because we are the app. We changed the fact that they don't have the political will right now.
But why don't they have that political will? If I was a politician in Latin America, I'd probably want to build infrastructure in the region, right? But we both of us agree that the region's infrastructure has been lacking in recent years. We've explained that the region's infrastructure has only started growing with aid from other foreign countries. But if you want, you can take a question.
Let's talk about Chile, right?
Sure.
What happened before Chile liberalized and opened up their economy to the rest of the world and started getting investment?
That's pretty broad. Do you want to tell me?
So the answer is that they joined the Mercosur deal. The Mercosur deal allowed them to regionally develop their economy, which invited more investment into the region as a whole. The problem is that for every single example they give of international trade bringing investment.
When was Mercosur created?
1991.
When did Chile liberalize its economy?
After 1991.
Our evidence from Lorraine explains that they liberalized their economy in the 1980s. Our argument is that because Chile liberalized its economy, it was able to attract more investment from other countries, which is why it was able to build things like infrastructure, which facilitated agreements like Mercosur. We can't have it your way, where the countries don't have the money to build infrastructure and hope and pray that everything will work out. We need investment in terms of other countries going into the region so that we can build up these regional trade agreements into the future and promote long-term economic growth. Did you want to follow up? Or?
Sure, we can take a question.
Okay. Let's talk about East Asia.
Yeah.
What do most East Asian countries, like for example, the examples you cite, like South Korea and Japan, what do they specialize in today?
Technology.
Okay, you can take a question.
Okay. So, yeah, actually, let's talk about East Asia.
Sure.
If you're right about Chile and their economic liberalization, why is Asia one of the most successful and diversified economies today when they did ASEAN before globalizing and before doing anything else with international trade?
Sure, I guess there's two things here. First, you guys just kind of posit that they worked through ASEAN and then increased their global trade. There was no evidence of that in the last week.
That's what our evidence directly says.
I
They
think
worked
you
with
said the
ASEAN
question
first.
Secondly, right, you can't just cross-apply a completely different part of the globe to Latin America. In our next speech, we'll explain why Latin America specifically does not have the place or ability to promote intra-regional trade in a way that would be beneficial. I think that's time for us.
The order of my speech will be beginning at the top of their case and responding to some of the broader claims they made about intra-regional trade. Then I'm going to address their specific arguments. Is anybody not ready? Overall, the issues that they cite about trade in Latin America, like political differences, exist in every part of the world, like Asia and Europe. But those regions, all of those regions required was a concerted effort to come to the table and negotiate. What we would say is that affirming forces larger countries to come to the table, who currently circumvent negotiations with the threat of simply continuing to trade internationally, preventing resolution of disputes. Overall, the thesis of our case is that you need a shift from international trade to intra-regional trade, which is what other regions like Asia and Europe went through, which is why ASEAN came before international trade. Remember, they began with intra-regional trade, then once that was established with infrastructure, they then shifted to international trade, which is why we see that countries like Korea and Japan are some of the most developed in the world, which is why overall, we're saying that Latin America should do the same. They cite a couple examples. For example, they say that the Pacific Alliance failed, but this empiric actually supports the affirmative side, because the economist Foster of Harvard in 2024 finds the Pacific Alliance's decline was due to China's growth slowing, since the region was too dependent on foreign nations for trade. This just proves our argument about economic diversification. Because of China's decline, we see that Latin America was harmed economically, but by diversifying their economy, they can change that. Then, they claim that Mercosur failed, but we will argue that in the short term, that countries truly focused on it succeeded. But decline was caused by a lack of intra-regional focus. At that point, let's get into their specific arguments. On their argument about foreign aid, realize that FDI is extremely volatile. It goes up and down. Even if they have evidence saying that currently FDI is increasing, we've seen historically that it's simply not reliable. For example, our UN evidence from CASE says that it decreased by 22% last year, which is a reason why you should not rely on foreign aid. We are going to argue that it is not safe to rely on the political environments of faraway countries. For example, if there is a political dispute or uprising in China, that can negatively affect Latin America unless they actually invest in each other, which creates incentive which increases incentive to prioritize the interests of the region itself. Additionally, Glasner just last month finds that funding to Latin American startups at the lowest level, investment withered as deal counts declined 39%. Additionally, their evidence that says that Biden is doing investment infrastructure is misconstrued. It actually is talking about humanitarian assistance, not infrastructure aid, which is not what their impact is talking about. Overall, remember our World Bank evidence from our case, which concludes that programs for intraregional trade facilitation reduce transportation costs through infrastructure by 67%, not only for intraregional trade, but also for international trade, which is a reason why focusing on intraregional trade will actually cause an increase in international trade. The next thing that we are going to argue is that regional organizations invite investment through reducing protectionism. The thesis of their digital trade argument is that we have to make international trade seem worse in order for people to do intra-regional. But we have made the argument through our evidence that intra-regional trade can happen if you just prioritize it and make it better. For example, Chong 20 finds that regional trade agreements are conducive to increased foreign investment by lowering trade barriers, reducing regulations, and increasing access to new markets. We realize that historical precedence proves that they would instead make intra-regional trade more effective. For example, Jamot 04 finds that in the short time that Mercosur was actually prioritized, that it resulted in a strong increase in inflows of FDI into the region. The achievement of macroeconomic stability appeared to be a precondition for the FDI response to materialize, which proves the thesis of our case to be true. But on this specific argument about digital trade, realize that infrastructure comes first. Technology only benefits the large countries with infrastructure to support them, and the political power to actually attract the investment from those AI companies. For example, Mexico and Brazil are able to get these deals, while these smaller countries are left behind. We are advocating for a more inclusive Latin America that includes all countries. Lastly, their evidence about jobs is talking about hiring professionals, which only helps people who already have an education and skilled workers, which just makes the rich richer. We are arguing for reprioritization, helping the people who really need it. Thus, you're voting after.
We're taking private start. That was 40 seconds. I'm going to start by responding to the rebuttal that you just heard, and then responding to my opponent's case. Everybody good? And then Sean, we good? All right. Let's start the time. Now, the first thing they tell you is that political differences exist all across the world, yet other countries have been successful. This misses every single warrant we gave you. Remember our evidence from Professor Felipe Lauren. He clearly tells you that there are a litany of reasons as to why trade has been bad, external of international trade. Being located in the tropics, exposed to disease, and extremely far away from other economic markets have all been slowdowns. Even beyond this, outdated laws and reliance on large agricultural plantations have severely limited trade, proving that ideological differences are not the only stopper in Latin America, which is why we say that there are other reasons why trade is slow, but international trade is the best way to go. The second thing they bring up is the ASON empiric, was saying that it began with regional trade. This is ahistoric. Number one, we tell you Latin America is inherently different. But number two, ASON received funding from the United States of America, proving that United States funding is the way to go. The third response they have is that the Pacific Alliance decline was because of China. Maybe in one scenario, but we've shown you that holistically, aid is the way to go, and there's been no long-term successful Latin American agreement. On our first argument about investment, the first response they have is that aid is volatile, but we say overall it has worked. The date evidence, which is unresponsive by them, says that they have invested billions of dollars in investment, which has had tangible impacts and increased efficiency by 75% throughout the region. The second response they have is that our evidence isn't about aid. No, the evidence I just referred to you is. The third response they have is that international trade can also increase if regional trade does. This is completely untrue. Resources are finite, and the Mercosur example proves that whenever we increase regional trade, our international players shift away, which is why our evidence finds that if the big countries think that Latin America focuses on Latin American countries, they will decrease their aid. On our last argument about modernization, the first response they have is that we should include all countries. Yes, we agree. How do we include all countries? We have bigger countries like the US help them because they are slow. The second response they have is that tech only helps the rich. Obviously not. Technology companies can bring tons of jobs to the region. We've highlighted that investments have already brought 20,000 throughout Latin America. But let's talk about my opponent's cases and the issues here. The first big point to note is that the benefits of the act only take place if intra-regional trade is successful, which it wouldn't be. The Council on Foreign Relations in 2023 explains that while the Mercosur Agreement is Latin America's largest trading bloc, it has failed and generated little economic growth. The reasoning comes from Professor O'Neill of Columbia University, their own evidence, who analyzes 12 past attempts and finds that leaders remain too politically divided, trade agreements fail, physical barriers cycle throughout, air connections are limited, and burdensome paperwork and checks combine to cause regional trade to cost twice as much as international trade and remain rhetoric. But on their first argument about infrastructure, their view and evidence saying that aid is declining is from 2022. Judges, think back to 2022. What was happening? The COVID pandemic was happening. Obviously, economies around the globe were slowing down, so they had to decrease things like aid. Our much more recent evidence explains that the US alone is investing another $2 billion. But second, the only historical example that they have of regional trade creating infrastructure is the World Bank evidence citing the AEO initiative. However, it is extremely important to note that the AEO is an example of international trade being good because the AEO was funded by the EU and the US Federal Reserve. So you should be negating in today's round. But on their second argument about diversification, although it is true that Latin America lacks diversification, the solution is not intra-regional trade. Rather, Lorenta 16 finds that countries need major investments to diversify and make their products competitive. In order to gain these investments, Latin America must focus on international trade with countries like China, the EU, and the US. The last thing you should note is that Thorler in 2023 explains that the situation is not as bad as they paint it to be, because FDI has increased by 55% in Latin America as new startups present attractive investment opportunities in the region, and the region has actually grown during times of recessions, proving that Latin America is not as bad as they say it is. This round boils down very simply. They say trade is bad. We say there are other reasons why trade is bad other than international trade. At that point, you're looking at what the best solution is. Will international trade bring more benefits, or will regional trade? They have one example of regional trade, and it's not even an example of regional trade because it was funded by international cooperations, which is why you are all negating.
Oh, what's the evidence that
The World Bank. Thorler?
like the very last one?
Thorler. Yeah.
Or where is it?
Can I just show you? It's in our block.
Yeah, which one?
Yeah, I'll just show it to you.
Wait, just tell me where it is. Okay.
It's in,
We'll take her out once I get it.
okay.
Start it now. We're gonna start. That was 9 seconds for reading the evidence. We're gonna start. More time. That was 2 minutes.
Would you like the first question?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
So you keep saying that you have all of these great reasons for why Latin America specifically can't trade with each other. Can you name one of them that doesn't exist in another part of the world?
Okay, there's 2 things to note there. The first is that even if the idea of cultural differences, for example, may exist in other parts of the world, they're not the same cultural differences as within Latin America. The second thing to note is that, well, I mean, I can start listing all the reasons.
Give
Like
me
tropical
one
geography,
second. Tropical geography. Is there tropics?
market.
Is there tropics in Southeast Asia?
Do you think there's more tropics in Asia or Latin America?
There's probably still tropics in Asia. And why does that
There's a
stop
lot
trade?
more
I think in the
tropics.
21st century we have
Big
ways
thing
to
to
like
note
fly
is that
over.
this is an analytical response, whereas our evidence is a holistic study.
Okay, your evidence just makes these claims, but like
It makes these
in,
claims
in the
and
round you
backs
can't
up
just
with
say like, oh, we have
historical
evidence, so we win the
So-
round. It's
so
about who makes the
I'll
better
take a question
analysis.
now on that point. What country in Latin America currently has the lowest poverty rates?
I don't know.
What was the only country in Latin? It's Chile. What was the only country in Latin America to liberalize their economy and open themselves up to international trade in the 1980s?
I mean, there's other countries like if you're talking about like that
What
specific
country
time.
opened itself the most?
I mean,
up
you're
to
just
international
citing
trade
your Chile example,
in the
but
past 40 years.
what?
I think it's pretty conclusive that our evidence finds that in 40 years of trade, Chile has done the most international trade and liberalized their economy first, and they also happen to have the lowest poverty rates. But you can take the
Well,
question.
that's just not true. If you search it up, Mexico has the highest levels of international trade in Latin
Right
America.
now it does, however, our evidence looks at a long-term study. Again, Mexico is also right next to the US, which is another reason why they, in general, are more attracted to international trade now. But you can take the question.
Okay. So let's go back to like these examples you have.
Mhm.
So let's go through some of them. You say that they're far away from like the center of markets.
Sure.
In the early 20th century, was the center of economic growth in Southeast Asia? Or was it?
I'm sure you can tell me.
It was in Europe. That's where like post World War II.
And do you think it's easier to transfer goods from Europe to Asia over land or all the way to South America over ships?
I think in the status quo, we see that the United States is a great place that has like plenty of like resources, and also
Unfortunately, that's only one country, whereas Europe has a couple dozen. May I take a question though
yeah,
on the
but
point of examples?
like we still have like ways to get across the ocean. There's
Sure.
billions of dollars in trade that happens.
Sure. May I take a question now?
Sure.
Name one example of a successful regional trade agreement in the past 40 years in Latin America.
Yeah. So our argument is that we haven't like necessarily been prioritizing it. But
Wait, let me stop
okay,
right
wait.
there.
Can
So
I answer
Latin
your
America
question?
has
Connor,
never
can I-
prioritized
Connor, you
regional
haven't-
trade.
Connor, you haven't let me answer your question.
It's missing the mark. Have they ever prioritized regional trade?
Yeah, they have.
And what happened?
Our argument is that Mercosur, when, like, you have conceded evidence that specifically when Mercosur was prioritizing international trade, it led to an increase in FDI flows into the region because it was seen as more stable. However, can I finish, please?
Yeah.
However, over time they transitioned back to international trade because, like, it's just something that's easier for them to do rather than just focusing on interregional
If
trade.
Mercosur was so successful, why did you just read me a bunch of statistics about over 100 million people lack access to trade?
Connor, I've been saying the same thing and it answers your question. They were prioritizing it, but then they stopped prioritizing it. Our argument is that you need to reprioritize. That is evidence that you have not responded to.
We'll contest that later.
Okay. Doing two more problems. Okay. We're gonna start present.
Actually, speaking of that evidence, can I see it?
Yeah.
Like, the one you just cited like 4 times. Just, I don't know where it is.
I'll email it to you.
You can just show me it. Okay. And I'll read this one. Sure. That was 6 seconds.
Alright, we're gonna take our own props starting now.
barrier voting in today's round is our first argument talking about infrastructure investments. Infrastructure investment in Latin America is lacking, but intra-regional trade forces countries to build more infrastructure to decrease trade costs. Otherwise, the UN finds that 500 million people lack basic necessities, and beyond that, Moreau finds that without infrastructure, international exports will not bring about growth. They make a few responses. First, they say that intra-regional trade has never worked, but they have conceded that these warrants are not specific whatsoever. Every single region across the entire world has had regional differences between each other, but we see in Asia that they do intra-regional trade. And they've conceded the warranting that when you make countries come to the table to get rid of these regional differences, we see international trade, which is what happened with Mercosur when they prioritized it. On infrastructure specifically, they say that our evidence is old. It's from 2022. No, it's not. The Glasner evidence from last month says that infrastructure investment is at an all-time low. Investment into Latin America is an all-time low right now. Then they say that the AEO program is just international trade. No, it's not. The only way that Latin American countries can get this money for the investment in the first place from the World Bank is if they make the pledge to do intra-regional trade and prioritize it first. It has a long application process that they need to go through. They only do it if they want to prioritize intra-regional trade, meaning that it's not international trade that gets it to them, it's a commitment to intra-regional trade that gets them the money. That gets them the money. On the comparative, infrastructure is the most important argument in this round. Whoever wins the argument on who gets the investment for infrastructure wins the round entirely. And by far, it is us. If you do not have infrastructure, you cannot do trade with other countries, and you cannot get investment from anywhere else. They have cold conceded the evidence that says that Mercosur, when it was prioritized, brought about more investment due to the fact that all the economies in the region were more harmonized and made for a better trading environment and investment environment for investors in the first place. Insofar as there's little investment right now, the affirmative is the only hope that we have to increase investment in the region. Let's talk about their case. On investment, remember, we both agree that investment is down now. But when you affirm, you increase investment, as we've seen with Mercosur. On their second argument, talking about modernization, they have cold conceded that when you do intra-regional trade, the regional trade agreements decrease. Intra-regional trade decreases the protectionism because the economies are more integrated, allowing for these supply chains to flourish. They also concede the fact that the U.S. only invests in the biggest countries in Latin America, like Brazil and Chile and Argentina, and not any of the smaller countries. And the fact that it's just professionals, not the people who actually need it the most, who do not have an education in the region right now. In the end, whoever wins who's getting the investment wins the rounds, and we're winning it by far.
We've used 46 seconds of prep time.
We'll take some of our remaining. So we're all on the same page before I start. It'll go a quick comparison at the top, then I'll look at the next case. Everyone good to go? In every speech, our opponents have argued that Latin America has lost and hasn't won because of global trade. However, they've conceded through multiple reasons from Professor Philippe Lorraine why trade historically has been bad in the region. Things like geographical issues and cultural differences have inhibited the trade, but international trade is providing new opportunities for things like infrastructure from countries like the US and China to solve these issues. Both sides agree that infrastructure is the solution for the future. The question you should do for the comparative here is first, if Latin American countries could so quickly and easily switch a flip and invest in infrastructure, why haven't they done it already? Every example they cite, including the AEO, as an example of when intra-regional trade has increased infrastructure has been because of US involvement and US funding. Ultimately, we'd argue that these big countries like the US and China will always have more capacity to build infrastructure, so Latin America should continue their ties with them. Beyond that, they've also conceded the day evidence, the only empirical evidence in the round that finds that infrastructure has been built, and it comes from the United States investment in the region. It finds that when the United States invested in Latin American infrastructure, infrastructure increased in efficiency by 75%. With that, let's look to the next case. Our argument here is very simple. It's that when right now, yes, there's some problems with infrastructure in the region. However, countries like China and the US are competing for trade in the region, which is why they're investing in infrastructure through billions of dollars of aid. That is key because both teams agree that 500 million people are at risk in the region, but beyond that is key for future trade. They have two responses. First, they say that investment is down now. No, their only evidence that says investment is down now is analyzing 2022, whereas more recent trends find that in fact infrastructure trade investment has increased, which is why the efficiency of the infrastructure is up 100%. Secondly, they cite the example of Mercosur as an example of how protectionism has decreased in the Af world and has led to more trade in infrastructure. No, their evidence of Mercosur is fundamentally flawed. They say Mercosur prioritized international trade, intra-regional trade, and it worked. But why isn't Mercosur working anymore as both sides agree? They say the solution is just to prioritize more. No, how often can we prioritize a failed promise? Ultimately, both sides agree that investment into infrastructure is critical. Only the NEG has the ability to provide that. Let's go to the AF case. The first thing that you should note is that intra-regional trade is not and will not be successful. They have conceded a few fundamental warrants insofar as A, there's geopolitical and geographical issues within the region which inhibit the countries from trading together, which is why every example they cite has either A, not worked in the long term, or B, if it has worked, has been funded by the United States. At that point, they say the differences exist in other parts of the world, but not to the extent as in Latin America, which is why they can't give you a single example of where their arguments have been true. That means that they cannot invest in infrastructure, and they cannot diversify their economies insofar as the intra-regional trade agreements will always fail. But on their argument about diversification in addition, they have cold conceded the dealer evidence which explains that you need foreign direct investment to diversify the industries in order to have the capacity to build diverse economies. For these reasons, we're proud to negate.
We're good for the question.
Yeah.
I'll take first question.
After Mercosur was started in 1991, what happened to foreign direct investment afterwards?
It increased in a short period, but in the long run, Mercosur has failed for the past 2
No.
decades.
Our argument is that after Mercosur was created, there was an increase in international investment. The warranty that you guys conceded was that this was because the region was more economically integrated, which allowed for greater investment.
Here's the problem,
Right. Here's the exact word you said in your sermon speech. You said when they prioritize Mercosur, it brought foreign aid. But we've given you reasons why there's reasons they can't prioritize it in the long run, even like ideological differences. So on that point, I'll ask a question. Are all countries in Latin America involved in Mercosur? No. Why not? What's the country that's not?
I'm not sure.
Like,
Why aren't they involved?
I know what you're getting at here. But
Why aren't they involved?
Because they're authoritarian.
Because they're suspended over ideological differences and not even allowed to come to the table to do things like
but
talks.
This is just like one small example. Our argument is that more broadly, if we have like a reprioritization of intra-regional trade, we can bring other countries to the table. Even if right now they're not willing to negotiate because they can always turn to international trade, our argument is that you force them to the table.
Wait,
like,
you have
all
the
of them-
timeline wrong.
Sorry, can I finish?
Sure.
Please. And you haven't made like any comparison to Latin America and the rest of the world. We have made arguments that every single issue that that you talked about existed in other parts of the world, but they were able to be solved. Like political differences, China and Japan are like very different. Same with South Korea. At the time in the 20th century, South Korea, Japan, and China, none of them really liked each other, but through prioritizing interregional trade, they were able to build organizations.
Japan and South Korea do not agree on economic policies.
Yeah, but
Yeah,
they still
that's exactly our
that's the
point.
point.
No, they do not trade high with each other. I am from Korea. I would know this more than like anyone else in this room. They are not close countries together. Like that is a terrible example to be using.
They're both in Asia.
They're both in Asia, but they
Yeah,
don't
okay,
trade with each other.
that's the point. They don't agree on economic policy, but they both participate in the same intra-regional trade organizations
No, we
with
just
each
said
other.
they don't.
Even if they do disagree with each other, all that shows is that despite political differences between nations, they will, when they prioritize intra-regional trade, they will get together and do it.
Sean, you're missing the second part of Connor's response, which is that because of their political differences, Japan and China do not trade highly with Japan and Korea don't Japan and Korea. I'm sorry, I misspoke. Do not trade highly together. Beyond that, the
10%
only
of
evidence
Japan's
you guys
exports
have.
were to South Korea.
And seeing that South Korea is right next to Japan, it should be a lot more, considering how, for example, the U.S. and Mexico have high amounts of trade with each other, which has been able to
a lot of the rest of it is
internationalize
places like
Mexico.
Japan.
I think we're getting a little bit in the weeds, right? But also, you guys should note that what you guys concede in every speech is that these organizations you talk about, like ASEAN, like the AEO, the only way they were successful is because of international involvement from players like the EU and the US.
But you missed my response that says that the only way that the international investment comes into these projects is when they signal that they want to prioritize intra-regional trade.
That's just not true because
Yes, it
international
is.
investment is increasing right now.
No. You conceded our Glassner evidence from this month that says that international investment is at an all-time low in the past 10 years.
That's awesome, but can I see the evidence that the U.S., like other countries, invested in Asia?
Yeah.
20 seconds left. All right. We're gonna take the rest of our prep starting now. Okay. The order of my speech is beginning on like some comparative of like empirics, and it's basically just gonna be infrastructure because that's what everyone's talking about. Also, anybody not ready? Both teams agree in this round that infrastructure is the most important asset that Latin America can have. However, we have offered you the best venue through domestic investment and countries investing in each other within Latin America. We can, if we prioritize intra-regional trade, we can change the current trends. They have agreed that currently, even after decades of international trade, Latin America's economy and infrastructure is stagnating, which is a reason why you should air aft on this argument, because even if you think that like maybe international trade could work, the fact that it hasn't for decades is a reason why our side is more true. The next question in this round is FDI increasing or decreasing? They continue to tell you that our evidence is talking about 2022. That was a separate piece of evidence, the UN evidence. However, what we are going for is the Glassner evidence, which is from April of this year, and finds that investment in companies within Latin America from outside is at an all-time low, which proves that FDI is inherently volatile. It depends on the political environments of faraway countries. Well, we are offering the only venue that is sustainable and will work into the future. Then, let's talk about some of these empirics. They make the argument that like international trade within Latin America will never ever work because of all these reasons. However, not a single reason that they have given you is unique to Latin America. Think about it. Political differences exist in Asia. China and Japan are very ideologically different, yet they were still able to trade. Same with places like Vietnam or China, Vietnam or South Korea. Same with places in the EU. For example, Germany and France didn't really like each other after World War II. But what our argument is overall that by prioritizing interregional trade, they can overcome these disagreements. They make the argument that the ASEAN required investment from the United States. However, when we ask for that evidence, their evidence is talking about in the status quo, the US is investing. That plays into our argument, which is that after they got up on their feet by themselves, that led to an increase in investment from other countries. Additionally, the World Bank empiric is also really good. It tells you that by prioritizing intra-regional trade, we can get investment from other countries. They say it was funded internationally, but the fact is that if you read the evidence, it required intra-regional trade before they actually invested in the first place. That's why we're so proud to affirm.
Starting with overview on the round, our arguments, their arguments. Go good? Throughout this round, we have argued that there are alternative reasons why trade is slow, but international trade is the best way to save. Because we have isolated 3 reasons: outdated laws, agricultural alliance, and geographic limitations. For Professor Felipe Lauren are all external reasons why trade has been slow, but we prove that international trade is the best way out of it. Let's explain why. The best question for you to ask yourself right now is, why haven't Latin American countries just done the regional investment on their own? Because we have isolated that it is functionally impossible, which is why throughout this entire round, the affirmative team has given you 0 successful examples of historical regional trade agreements. The only response they've given to this is that number 1, Mercosur led to more trade. We show you that in the long run, Mercosur has failed to our more recent evidence, and even if it led to a short-term increase in trade, look at what's happening right now. Venezuela is suspended from Mercosur, which is what we all agreed in the last crossfire, proving that ideological differences will stop trade from happening, just saying that we will prioritize it more when they have for the past 12 attempts proved that is not going to change. At that point, the only other argument they've made throughout this round is that investment is down right now. Sure, it's down right now, but we've argued that in the long run, foreign countries have an incentive to stay with these investments, which is why in the overall, our day's evidence says that United States investments have increased efficiency of trade by 75%, which I urge you to note is the only historical example of any trade agreement being successful to stopping infrastructure. If you're voting for infrastructure, you're voting for the only side that has historically built infrastructure, which is our side. At that point, our argument is very simple. We say that right now infrastructure is failing, but international trade is the best way to get out of it. Do things like investments, which invest into their infrastructure, saving millions of lives and lifting people out of poverty. At that point, we can look at their arguments about regional trade, which I've already responded to. Remember that at the end of this round, both sides want infrastructure, but history tells you what happens. Mercosur did not lead to long-term trade. Their World Bank example of the AEO is funded by the EU. They just say that it was required to have regional trade first. That is not true. The investment into the AEO came from the EU and the US Federal Department, which is what their own evidence concludes. History tells you that international trade is the way to go, and regional trade has always failed, which is why you are negating.